This is Learn from Others, where we interview a cross-section of successful individuals so you can learn from their experiences, achievements, and even their mistakes. We ask 4 questions that will educate and inspire. Greg Stanley will be your guide as we join our guest on a journey from adolescent daydreaming to success in today's world. Join us on this adventure as we learn from others together.
Welcome to Learn from Others, where we help others succeed by sharing success. I'm very excited to introduce our special guest, Rick Terrell. Rick, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Well, thank you for taking us on your career journey. Before we find out what you're doing today, let's start at the very beginning, and please tell us, what did you want to be when you grew up?
That's a real interesting question. I don't know if I had a specific career objective, as when I started my journey, high school, college. I probably wanted to be independent. I wanted to have a career that would allow me to leave the house, even though my parents were great, but independence is very important too.
Yeah, got to get out of here.
Yeah, and allow me to be self-sustaining. I went into engineering post-high school, and I really didn't even know what an engineer did, but I went to a pretty small high school, predominantly African-American, and I was very good in math and the sciences and was a pretty good student. So the high school counselors all said, well, you should be an engineer, even though I didn't know what an engineer did. And then when I looked at starting salaries of different careers, engineers was near the top of the curve, and I said, oh, well, must be for me.
Right.
So I went to the University of Cincinnati, and I studied electrical engineering. And then coming out of that, then I started to work for Proctor & Gamble. And even my college time, even though I went into engineering, I probably learned more about leadership in terms of the different organizations I was in that probably was critical to my professional success more than what I would consider like the engineering course.
Interesting. Well, let's talk about that in a little more depth in a second. What was your first job, one where you felt like you had some type of responsibility?
Being in high school, they had a lot of programs to introduce students, especially students from more disadvantaged backgrounds, to professional careers, and I was chosen to be a high school intern at a automotive plant, specifically Delco Moraine. At the time I grew up in Dayton, Ohio. Dayton had a number of General Motors plants. Matter of fact, both of my parents worked for General Motors as plant hourly employees. So I had an opportunity to come to General Motors working at this particular plant. The name of the plant was Delco Moraine. They made brakes for all the General Motors cars, and just what I would consider like administrative work, data tabulation, those types of things. And it was just a way just to introduce me to just the world of work, because I've never experienced anything like that before.
That's really cool to have an internship like that. I actually put some Delco brakes on my old Mustang before I sold it. So there you go. I'm pretty sure you had nothing to do with that, but there you go. Well, and it sounded like math. Was that your favorite subject in school?
I would probably say actually English was. I was good in math, but I really enjoyed writing. I really enjoyed, at that time, watching sports. I was a big sports fan from high school to college to professional, still am today. We had 2 newspapers in town, the Dayton Daily News and the Journal Herald. I would read the sports sections from cover to cover. My dad had a subscription to Sports Illustrated. I used to love to read those articles. And now that I think about it, you asked me the first question in terms of what I wanted to be. Probably at that time, if I could chose to, have the perfect career, it probably would have been watching sports and writing about it.
Oh yeah. Now I could guess, but who were your favorite teams?
At the time, growing up, probably professionally, was the Dallas Cowboys. At that time, like Roger Staubach, Tony Dorsett, those players from years ago. And since I lived in Dayton my entire life, we would be real big Ohio State Buckeye fans. So even to this day, I am a fanatic Ohio State Buckeye fan. So football is probably my favorite sport, and probably college football is probably my favorite.
Okay, I would have guessed Ohio State. I didn't see the Dallas Cowboys coming, but that makes sense for the time frame of the year. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, the Bengals were kind of like, still as disappointing as they are today. So, no, they didn't get a lot of success at that time.
It's tradition. Oh, goodness. Well, can you talk a little bit about what you mentioned in college, the different groups you were involved with, and how you got so much out of those groups that really helped you today?
When I was in college, I, joined the fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha, Fraternity Incorporated. And Alpha Phi Alpha was the first African-American fraternity started in the United States. Actually started in 1906. And, a number of people, such as, Martin Luther King and Paul Robeson and others were members of Alpha Phi Alpha. And I really didn't necessarily know much about fraternities. Neither one of my parents went to college. But I had a couple of friends who, they said they were going to join, and it was kind of like, hey, following the crowd. So, I ended up following the crowd and pledging and joining the fraternity. And it was probably a defining moment in my life where I was surrounded by men who were progressive, men who, had kind of like a vision in terms of what they wanted in their lives and where they wanted to go professionally and whatnot. So, I was able to get some mentors from that standpoint. And from the time I joined the fraternity early in my college career to the time I ended my college career, my last year, I was president of the fraternity. So I had an opportunity to learn leadership skills, how to get things done, how to form a consensus with, people that have, very, very diverse viewpoints and this type of thing, thinking about, hey, what's the vision for the organization, how are we going to get there, how do I provide the level of leadership and whatnot. And that's probably one of the most successful experiences I had that really helped me professionally in terms of what I do today.
Well, that's great. Were there any other groups you were involved in college?
I was involved in the National Society of Black Engineers, was a member there, and there were a couple other like professional groups I was in relative to engineering and whatnot. But I would say my college fraternity is probably where I spent the most of my time, outside of the coursework at school.
And I imagine you're probably still in touch with quite a few of your fraternity brothers even to this day.
Yes, exactly. Matter of fact, this week, December the 5th, was the date that, my pledge class, December the 5th, 1982, was the date my pledge class, joined the fraternity. And, all this week, I have gotten just hundreds of emails and
wow.
texts, this type of thing in terms of, people saying, oh, man, that was the greatest time. I miss you guys. And, and this type of thing. And we look back on it. Oh, my goodness, that was 36 years ago.
That's scary.
From that standpoint. So, again, I don't necessarily have any desire to go back in history to relive those days because, again, I think my life is probably more fulfilling now. But I reflect on those days fondly, and that period of time was probably the most fun I've ever had in my life.
That's awesome. That's great. Great memories. Well, what do you do today, if you would? What's your job title, and who do you work for, and what do you do?
I work for Proctor & Gamble. I've been with P&G for 31 years, and my current role is Global Labor Relations Manager. So I have responsibility to help the company maintain great labor relations with our employees, specifically employees in a manufacturing environment. They are typically employees who are hourly employees who didn't come into the company from a professional or degree type of program for the most part, and making sure that we have the type of relations that allow us to have agile and flexible supply chains such that, we can meet our business needs and not have things such as strikes or slowdowns or business disruptions that could potentially put the business at risk. So when it comes to our plants that have unions, helping those particular sites negotiate collective bargaining agreements, which, again, give us the agility and flexibility to pivot and manage the business to, meet short-term and long-term business goals. And even at our sites that do not have unions, making sure that we have systems and strategies in place that we can maintain positive relationships with our, employees at these factories and manufacturing sites.
Wow, that's just really fascinating job you have there. Could you give us kind of a stepping stone walk to how you got into this position and the previous roles that led up to it?
Probably even if I start before I even got to Procter & Gamble, I think I mentioned earlier that my parents were factory employees at General Motors. So my parents were part of what we would consider the Great Migration, African Americans coming to the north to get better jobs. My parents were born in the state of Mississippi. So the way it worked was my father's oldest sister and her husband, came to Dayton. They got a job at General Motors. My parents then left Mississippi, lived with them. My dad gets a job at General Motors. They get established. Then their younger brother comes and lives with them. They get a job at General Motors. They get established, and on and on and on. So I had quite a few uncles and aunts who worked at General Motors in Dayton, and again, and that cycle, perpetuated itself for a good portion of my family. All of my parents were hourly employees, my aunts and uncles, and they were all union employees. So that was kind of like my first exposure to the union.
That was my next question.
Hey, you know,
was it
yeah.
were the union? Because then, you know, the insights you have as a young kid at that point probably you know, dramatically affected how you view things today.
Exactly. So I had a good perspective in terms of how, you know, hourly employees and how the unions would look at things, you know, this type of thing, how they felt about company strategies, how they felt about, you know, did they feel they were being taken advantage of, or was this, you know, not only a good thing for the company, but a good thing for the union employees and this type of thing. So I kind of like grew up with that. So then when I came to Procter & Gamble as a manager, my first role was a manufacturing manager on a packing floor which produced Tide detergent. And these were all union employees. In terms of just, you know, relationally, you know, relating to them in terms of their issues and whatnot, the fact that I kind of like grew up with my parents having that type of environment, I could really translate, you know, what P&G was trying to do in terms of, you know, in a way that was meaningful and meant value for them. And one of the things that, you know, I learned very early on in my career is part of my challenge was, as the company had different strategies, I had to take those strategies and communicate it in terms of where people could see what was in it for them, you know, this type of thing. It wasn't about, hey, you know, the company being successful, but personally they needed to feel like, hey, you know, we were gaining something relative to that as well. So I worked at that particular facility, was a union facility, and up until the point where I got my current role, every plant I worked at Procter & Gamble was a union plant. Wow. and I'm one of the few people who had that kind of experience. So then when I got to the point where I am now in terms of being global labor relations manager, I had experience with many different types of unions and many different types of plants, and was able to, you know, take, you know, what we did on the production floor and translate those into more global and corporate strategies.
Expand on that a little bit, many different types of unions.
In terms of unions, when we think about when labor unions started in probably the early 20th century, like in the 1920s and the 30s and whatnot, they were formed because companies, you know, were taking advantage of workers. You know, child labor, issues with safety and health and this type of thing. So, again, because the companies were taking advantage of people politically, you know, people banded together and they say, hey, we're going to form a union to have some leverage over these companies such that they don't take advantage of us. So when I say different types of unions, there are some unions that are national in nature, such as the United Auto Workers. Teamsters have very large global platforms, and they have lobbyists in Washington, D.C., and, you know, on and on and on. And, you know, and they have a particular agenda that they want nationally. And then there are what we would call independent unions, where the union is just at that particular site, and they don't really have any national affiliation. So basically the only leverage is at that single site. And clearly the approach from a national standpoint is different than the approach from a local independent union, and I've had opportunities to work kind of like in both realms. The local independent union is typically more concerned with, hey, what's going on at that particular location, while a national union has a particular national agenda, which may or may not include that local body who, you know, represents Procter & Gamble and whatnot, but we have to be able to talk both languages such that the national union gets what they're looking for at the same time the local employees get what they're looking for as well.
Yeah, so I can see yourself in a difficult position at times where the national wants one thing and the local wants something slightly different.
Exactly.
They might not always be on the same page.
Exactly.
You said you moved from different plants. Was that for experience, to get exposed to different product lines or different work environments or different locations or larger capacity? What was and what did you get from moving around to those different locations? Procter
& Gamble typically has a promote from within culture, where, you know, individuals come in, and, you know, our primary source of professional talent comes from college and universities, with the assumption that those individuals come in, you know, as newly minted college graduates, and they work for the company 15, 20, 25 years, getting more and more responsibility, and they represent future leaders of the company. And one of the things we would say when we're recruiting is that we're not recruiting entry-level managers, we're recruiting future vice presidents, future plant managers, future directors, this type of thing. So based on that, the company has, you know, a career model where every 3 to 5 years they want you to see a different aspect of the business or a different location, such that when you do get in those higher levels of responsibility, you kind of like understand the diversity of locations, the diversity of businesses, the diversity of cultures, such that you can be a better leader from a global or regional standpoint.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Get a nice broad scope of skills, you know, by doing those different positions. Well, I know that you work on the global level, and we've talked before about some of your trips overseas to China and different places. And before this call, you just mentioned you might be going to India, and I just can't wrap my brain around. You walk in that door, what are you doing exactly? So if you could kind of walk through, it doesn't have to be that particular example, but, a foreign country, you're walking into the door. What is the discussion all about? Are you trying to get an overview of how they're set up, from a labor perspective, how you can integrate them into the overall goals of P&G? Is that kind of what you're doing?
Well, one of the things, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier, is that I think that helped me from a global standpoint is once I made the professional decision to stay in human resources and in labor relations specifically, I went back to school and I got my master's degree in human resources from Penn State University. One of the things that did was my concentration was in labor and collective bargaining, but they had a number of courses on international labor relations, and that was very helpful for me as I think about, doing things outside the U.S. Again, as I mentioned before, my experience within the U.S. was extremely helpful to deal with, what I would consider concerns in our U.S.-based plants, but I didn't have much experience internationally, and that time in school really helped to gain some perspective. So one of the things that I have to do anytime I go to a new country to discuss this is first begin to study what is the employment law principles in that particular country. Again, every country is different. For example, in China, everybody belongs to a union. Even the managers, the vice presidents and general managers in P&G belongs to the union because the union is a subset of the Communist Party. Mm-hmm. So as they think about labor relations, it's different than, say, what we would see kind of like in the U.S. So the first thing I do is I study kind of like the law in terms of the particular country. The next thing I do is then I begin to study the culture relative to labor relations because, again, the culture is different. For example, in Thailand, typically within P&G globally, we have the plant manager negotiate our labor agreement. In Thailand, saving face and also having a culture where leaders do not get into the weeds is very important culturally. So in Thailand, the plant manager doesn't do the negotiating. The plant manager designates the negotiator from one of his or her managers, and they do the negotiation, and the plant manager comes at the beginning of the negotiations and the end of the negotiations and do the final sign-off. So again, that's different culturally in Thailand. So before I even walk in the door, I do some research on my own to understand what the law is and understand culturally from a labor relations standpoint. And then once I do get on the ground, the first thing I do is just listen. I just listen to, hey, what the concerns are, what the issues are, this type of thing, and then take into account what is the law, what is the cultural parameters, and what our principles are corporately relative to labor relations to come up with solutions that, again, principally still fit within corporately what we're trying to do, but it's very situational based on the labor law and the culture in that particular region.
Right. Now, have you ever, I know you're so used to the U.S., at least, in the early part of your career, kind of how the manufacturing plants work and the expectations and the safety and the regulations. And even in that world, I'm sure you see some stuff that you're like, whoa, that needs to be cleaned up or that needs to be fixed. Have you ever gone overseas and have just been like blown away by the difference, whether it's from a safety perspective or work conditions? Can you talk a little bit about that, or have you seen it's pretty consistent?
I would say within P&G, it's pretty consistent. I mean, P&G has been a company, we're kind of like approaching 200 years as a company. and I can go into a P&G plant in Vallejo, Mexico, or Bangkok, or Green Bay, and this type of thing. When I walk in, it looks the same.
Wow,
that's
impressive.
Type of thing in terms of the plant. And the other thing we have as I have as an advantage is the company was founded in the U.S. So again, and within P&G, the language of business is English. So when we see the charts and the graphs and we go on the sites, regardless of what country we're in, they're all in English. So they're really easy for me to interpret, to understand, and this type of thing. So I would say it's pretty consistent from that standpoint. One cultural nuance I have noticed, especially when I compare, say, the U.S. to Asia, and again, it's just culture. It's not right or wrong. It's just different, When I think about the U.S., when I think about how this country was founded and the reasons for the Revolutionary War and separating from Britain and on and on and on, it was because, hey, people wanted a voice, this type of thing. And so we think about today, even our political system and how we think democracy. Everybody wants a say in terms of what we do. So the thing about labor relations at our U.S. sites is kind of like everybody wants a say. So just because you're the manager, people need to understand why, because if they don't understand why, they're going to push back. This type of thing. Asia has a much more differential culture. If someone is in a position of leadership and they say this is what we need to do, people just do it. I mean, and again, it's not a right or wrong thing, but that's just their culture, from that standpoint. So from a labor relations standpoint, it's not, I wouldn't say easier, but it takes more to draw out people's concerns, because again, we want kind of like participatory management. We want everybody to be able to weigh in terms of our business strategies, because principally the people that are closest to the work kind of like know what's best. But sometimes in Asia, it's difficult to pull that out because people are so differential. Hey, people tell you exactly what they think all the time.
Yeah, right. No, that's really fascinating. You definitely have to know that before you get there. And have you started your homework on India yet? India labor laws?
Yes, I have started my homework on India. So right now I'm understanding labor law, and right now I am taking the time to understand culturally what's going on. And not typically, but one of the things that I am learning in India is there are a lot more stakeholders. Typically, like in the U.S., when it comes to, unions and labor relations, the U.S. government is pretty hands-off, except for, I would say, lobbyists in Washington. Like, the government doesn't come in and try to influence, when we negotiate a labor contract, which you should and should not put in it. It's kind of different in India. Everyone wants, I always equate it, it's like a Christmas tree. Everybody wants to see their ornament. There's just a lot more stakeholders in terms of that has to be managed, from that standpoint. So that's one of my initial insights that I'm learning about India culturally in terms of this labor relations space.
That's very timely illustration there, a Christmas tree. So. Well, before we move on to our next question, let's take a moment to hear from our sponsors. Do you enjoy your job and find it fulfilling? Or do you spend more time wondering what if instead of what's next? If so, contact Career Spa. Career Spa has extensive programs and curriculum and understands the challenges faced by individuals in transition. They can teach these success practices to be mastered for an effective job search. Answer that what if question by contacting Career Spa and asking their experts, what's next? Contact Career Spa at careerspa.net. Talent acquisition is key to building a successful organization. Talent Connections is a professional services firm that specializes in recruiting, including executive search, contract recruiting, talent acquisition consulting, and recruitment process outsourcing. Whether you are an individual or a Fortune 100 company, Talent Connections can connect you with success. Contact them at talentconnections.net. Welcome back. As a reminder, you can check out all previous episodes at learnfromothers.org. If you're an educator or student, you can search for podcasts by career cluster, and additional resources are under the resource tab. So we just learned what you wanted to be when you grew up, which you weren't 100% sure, maybe a sports writer, and what you actually do today. So if you could do it all over again, what would you do differently?
I really feel fortunate and frankly blessed to where I am now. I didn't know what this work was 30 years ago. Now that I'm doing it, I can't imagine doing anything else. So it's just, I would say, just the providence of God, just, seeing things that I couldn't see and giving me experiences that position me for what I do now, because I truly enjoy what I do. If I did have to do something differently, and especially early on in my career, I would have probably approached the job with a lot more confidence. Again, I was the first person for my family to go to college. I was the first person in my family who was a quote-unquote manager. All my other family were union employees, hourly employees, factory workers, and whatnot. So I would see kind of like, other resources, other managers who maybe have been with the company 5, 10 years longer than I have, and I was like, wow, I'll never know as much as they do. It's almost like, hey, they're just, just know everything, and I'm just learning, and this kind of thing. And now that, as I look back on it, man, they didn't know much more than I did. This kind of thing. But they were just confident in terms of what they were talking about, from that standpoint. So I if I could do it all over again, I think I would have trusted myself more, trusted my gut more in terms of the things that I thought was right, or principally what I thought was the right thing to do, versus deferring based on my belief that, well, I'm not as experienced, so my opinion doesn't carry as much weight. No, it carried just as much weight, but I just didn't have the confidence at that time to express it the way I can now.
Let's make the assumption that someone wants to do what you do, to be a global labor relations manager. what advice would you give them? And it sounds like there might be some specific college degrees they would need to get. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think clearly a human resources career path would probably help you gain that foundation. I think anything and from a technical background that would get you in a manufacturing type of environment, where you're, understanding the technology. That's one of the things that at the time, and we still do it today, where P&G hires engineers for manufacturing management because the belief is, hey, we can teach you the leadership, but we don't want to have to teach you the technology behind how machines work and this type of thing. So typically we hire engineers. So I would say someone wanting to be in a HR or a technical career path from an education standpoint. And then the other thing too is if you're interested in labor relations, it's kind of like put yourself in situations early on in your career where you're interacting and engaging with labor, and that labor can be factory workers, that labor can be, software programmers, this type of thing, because again, any place where we have large groups of employees, there's going to be a level of labor. And a way to think about it is, there's a function called employee relationships and there's a function called labor relationships. Employee relationships is typically the relationship between a single employee and the company, which typically gets involved in terms of that employee's individual interests, their individual performance, their individual needs, this type of thing. While labor relationship is about groups of employees, where we got large groups of employees who have similar interests, and how does a company interface and interact with them. So I would say put yourself in situations where you're in the midst of, those groups of employees, because I think once you're within those groups, you'll have a better appreciation for their concerns, how they interpret what companies try to do and whatnot, and that'll lend itself to, once you get to the point where you are influence corporate strategies, you will have a better insight in terms of, hey, how you can make it meaningful not only for the employees but for the company as well.
Well, are there any current projects you're working on that you would like to share?
One project that I've been working on for the past couple of years is how do we systematize knowledge? I'm reading a book now by the CEO of Red Hat Software, and I can't think of his name at the moment, but the book is called The Open Organization. And one of the terms he uses is how do we do things within business that moves at the speed of business? Because as we think about business today, it's radically different than it was 20 years ago. Matter of fact, it's radically different than it was 5 years ago because the internet and just the speed of knowledge. So one of the things that I'm working on is right now, again, I'm a resource for labor relations for P&G. But again, I can't be everywhere at the same time. But our business is growing and we have labor challenges everywhere, this kind of thing. Traditionally, the way we've done it is we would take individuals who were considered subject matter experts like myself, and we would send them to different areas of the globe where our business is changing so fast. It's kind of like, one, if there's not enough travel dollars, and two, by the time you send somebody there and they come back, the business situation has changed again. So we're really working on how do we systematize knowledge? How do we share knowledge in the labor relations space in a way that is real time, that is timely, and people can access it based on, when they need it. It's almost like, real-time development or just-in-time development. So we're doing a lot more in terms of, as opposed to doing what I would consider face-to-face engagements, hosting webinars, creating podcasts, doing things, developing self-directed web-based training to build that capability. An example would be a couple years ago I was in China doing some training and building some capability in the labor relations space. Well, before I went there, we used the technology to give people kind of like a baseline understanding of what I would consider basic concepts, like what is a union, what's a union interest, why do people join unions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, such that when our team got there to, meet face-to-face, we could talk more complex situations versus having to fly all the way around the globe just to explain the basics. We can explain the basics virtually, but when we do fly around the globe, we want to talk real business situations, complex situations that we can help, those businesses work through, and that just makes our time much more efficient. So from a project standpoint, we are really, really continuing to press and press the envelope in terms of how can we systematize knowledge and get more knowledge to more people in different areas of the globe such that they can have the capability to deal with whatever labor issues they're dealing with that may be, impacting their business.
Wow, that sounds like a great project, and it sounds like it's really taking on some steam. You mentioned that in China, everybody's union, because it's a communist party. And from my layman perspective, I always think as unions are there because they're fighting for the little guy. They want to get a little bit more wage. They want to fight for proper working conditions. And then also from my layman's perspective, I think of China, I think the workforce is repressed. Everything is a low wage. That's why all of our manufacturing has gone over there. And I know recently all the manufacturing has created the middle class, but an actual middle class in China. But can you speak to the Chinese union and how it relates to doing the right thing for the employees?
Well, I think one of the things that is different from between the China approach and the U.S. approach, I agree with you that unions were there in the U.S. were formed to allow people to gain leverage by, like you said, fighting for the little guy, this type of thing, given the amount of leverage that companies had at that time. I think the development of unions in China was for a different reason. I think the government and the Communist Party wants to, have significant control over the economic policy in that particular country. So by having everyone in the union, what they can do is when they, talk about opening plants or, what's going to be, our particular labor strategy and whatnot, since everybody's in a union, everybody has to follow lockstep in terms of, hey, this is what the country is trying to do relative to its economic policy. While in the U.S. it's much more organic, I would say in China it's much more prescriptive, and having everybody in the union allows the country to move the economic policy in lockstep because people are kind of like bound by whatever the government policy is.
Yeah, that really is fascinating, and I can see why you definitely need to study up on your country history and law before we walk in there, for sure.
Yep.
So that's fascinating. Well, as with most journeys, success largely depends on reliable transportation. And since I'm a huge car enthusiast, would you mind telling us what was your first car?
My first car was when I was in college. My freshman year, I didn't have a car. We lived on campus. My sophomore year, we moved probably a mile away from campus, so we walked. And in the wintertime, I was kind of like, oh, my goodness, I can't do this every day. This kind of thing. So I told my Dad, you got to get me a car. This kind of thing. He said, hey, I'll pay you back. And after probably begging for about a month, he, picked me up, brought me to Dayton, took me to car dealership. Said, okay, we're going to pick up your car. And it was a Chevy Monza station wagon.
Oh, my gosh.
And this was probably 1982. So this station wagon was probably 1976. This kind of thing. And then, again, I'm in college and, I'm trying to be a cool guy and this type of thing. And I didn't necessarily want a station wagon, but it's kind of like, hey, I can't complain because I didn't even have a car, this kind of thing. But yes, a Chevy Monza station wagon, 1976. I think I had it for a year. And when I got my first internship, I think about a year later, I traded it in and got a Mustang.
What year was the Mustang?
The Mustang was probably 1978.
Okay. So was the first car blue by chance?
No, the first car was gold.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Gold Chevy Monza station. And actually, as I think about it, it was more reliable than the Mustang I wanted. The Mustang looked cool, but it wasn't as reliable as the station wagon.
Oh, that's funny. People today think, you should never have an automobile issue. Even 20, 30 years ago, a new car, you could have some issues, So.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, what is your dream car, if you have one?
When I first got out of college, my dream car was a Nissan 300ZX, this type of thing. I think I bought an Audi 4000 right when I got out of college, and after I had it for a year, I said, oh, man, I should have got that sports car, this kind of thing. And that was
that is neat, though.
Yeah, it was nice. It was nice. And then, I got married, and then the whole car thing kind of like, fell off, kind of like the wayside, this kind of thing. Probably if I had an opportunity to get a car now, and it would be my dream car, it would probably be a Lexus, and it would probably be the Lexus Coupe.
Nice.
This type of thing. I can't remember, but it's the one that's got the retractable roof, the hard top retractable roof, this type of thing. That would probably be my dream car.
Nice. Well, one great perk to some jobs is a company car. And if I had all the money in the world, I'd love to buy a really cool company car based on your job. So here's my, you're probably like, where are you going with this? So you're all about labor relations. So that took me back to the 1908 Model T. And that's not the car I picked for you because that's just, it's not really that cool. But reason being is Henry Ford was able to put in the $5 workday, which actually started to establish the middle class, and you probably know more about this than I do.
Yep.
But he actually, was able to make some great labor relations. I decided to pick a really good labor relations story, as the starting point of this.
Yep.
So then I went down the global route. So I thought, well, what's a Ford that's kind of a global car? Mm-hmm. In I think it was 67, the Ford GT, they had 3 of them that won Le Mans, beating Ferrari, 1, 2, 3, podium finish. And one particular car actually won 2 years in a row, which is unheard of in 24-hour racing, and it was a Gulf Oil GT40 supercar. Uh-huh. So I thought, all right, well, that's it. Well, then I thought, well, that's a race car. So as chance would have it, they're releasing that car again in the new GT, and it's coming out this next year with the Gulf Oil livery on it. So the car I picked for you is a 2019 Ford GT with the racing stripes and everything on it. So if I had all the money in the world, that's the car I picked for you. It's comfortable. It's actually has AC, and it's very fast. Cool.
No, I appreciate that. I'll have to go online and take a look at that and a picture, and I appreciate the level of thought that you gave on that. One last thing.
Much.
No. It was definitely appropriate. One other thing when you talk about the car, and I've been, noodling this back and forth because, again, I have my wife, she gets the new cars and I drive the old car.
Right.
This kind of
smart
thing.
Man.
But, yeah. But one of the things I've given some thought to, and especially as I'll retire in a few years, and I'm sure I'll get, whatever car I want, is really thinking about, a General Motors car, like a Cadillac. Because one of the things that, is becoming more and more compelling to me as I get older, and especially when I think about my parents and their entry to the middle class. General Motors, the U.S. Auto industry at the time, allowed many African Americans to get to the middle class, this type of thing. And many African Americans, I wouldn't have the positions or the opportunities I had if, my parents didn't, have those opportunities. So when I think about the migration, especially for a lot of people of color, coming to Dayton and Toledo and Detroit and Chicago and St. Louis, the U.S. auto industry really, and the unions, the UAW, provided a gateway to the middle class. So part of me is kind of like, hey, in my, latter golden years, maybe, I'll get a Cadillac type thing just as a sign of respect to, the U.S. auto workers who, had an opportunity to go from, what I would consider the fields of Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and South Carolina to get, like what I said, middle-class paying jobs at U.S. auto factories.
No, that's great. And Cadillac, they're making some gorgeous, super nice cars. And
yes.
Just a little plug here, if you want to go back to, I think it was our 3rd episode, Laura Klosser is the program manager for Cadillac Racing, and she went to pretty in-depth on her role with Cadillac and GM over the years. It was a really great interview. So, that's a great point. Yeah, they make some really fast Cadillacs today, too.
Yeah, they do. They do.
Well, thank you so much for taking us on your journey. What's the best way our listeners can learn more about you or P&G?
I would say if you want to learn more about P&G, we have a corporate website, pg.com. And again, not only talks about P&G products, but also the careers and the path for careers if you are interested in a career at P&G.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Rick, so much for taking us on your career journey today.
Okay, and Greg, thank you for just the opportunity to share, and also just thank you for the opportunity of just being a friend.
Awesome. Thanks, man.
Thank you for listening to Learn from Others, where we help others succeed by sharing success. Where will our next adventure take us? Subscribe to find out. If you know of someone who has a cool career story or occupation, contact Greg through Instagram at Greg Stanley LFO. That's GregStanley LFO. And we will see you soon as we learn from others together.